Well, welcome to the second ESG talk organized by Candriam about the EU ESG related regulation. This is a talk organized as part of our effort to bring education and knowledge to the investment community, especially about ESG. A few housekeeping points. You can ask any question you like through the Q&A box. I will check it regularly and feed the questions to our panelists as we move along in the discussion. My name is David Czupryna. I'm head of ESG development at Candriam. And with me today, we have Eleonore Bedel. Eleonore joined BNP Paribas Group in 2002 and has been head of sustainable and responsible investments within BNP Paribas Wealth Management since 2011. Hi, Eleonore. Second, we have Dominique Radal. Dominique has been working with Michelin since 1999 and is currently Vice President in Sustainable Performance and Transformation with Michelin. Hi, Dominique. And finally, we have with us Andreas Höppner. Andreas is full professor of operational risk, banking and finance at Smurfit Graduate Business School of University College Dublin and has been a member of the EU Technical Expert Group on Sustainable Finance and now a member of the Platform on Sustainable Finance and is a member in a personal capacity. And he's very keen on that. Hi, Andreas.
Hey, David. Thanks for having me.
So as I alluded to, the point today is really to bring some light into the shadows of these multiple regulations that we are now seeing coming live within Europe. It's all started with the Paris Agreement in 2015. Everyone is aware of that. Later on, the EU set up an action plan on sustainable finance. The aim of this action plan is to redirect capital flows towards sustainable activities. And that capital plan defined this sustainable plan defined in 2018 then led to the creation of the technical expert group Andreas was a member of, which itself then led to the creation of these regulations we are going to talk about today. So Andreas, I invite you to share your screen now if you'd like. And the first question is for you. What does it mean for the EU to become carbon neutral as the plan stands today? Does it mean that we are going back to candles and horses? And can you shed some lights about how it connects to the Green Deal and the taxonomy, over which we will go in depth in a few minutes?
David, can you hear me well? And can you see my screen?
Yes, I can hear you very well, and we see your screen as well. Thank you.
Okay, so first, it's very important to say we're focusing on net zero by 2050. And that is the European Commission and every European member state except Poland. That's very different from carbon neutral, because while carbon neutral, while net zero means that you're also carbon neutral doesn't mean that you're net zero. Let me explain this in terms of time. So HSBC, for instance, claims to be carbon neutral since 2005. However, they'll only be net zero in the best case by 2030, 2035. And the reason for that is carbon neutral is very easy. You can use so-called avoided emissions to calculate yourself carbon neutral. It's a bit of an opportunity gain for instance, investing in renewable energies, or I could pay someone I know not to cut down some Irish forest, and I would actually have avoided emissions on my bank account if you want so. So carbon neutral is historically a useful concept to get people interested, but it's far away from net zero. So the European Commission is aiming for net zero. This would imply that they're also carbon neutral, but carbon neutral alone is far from enough to reach the Paris Agreement. So then, to reach the Paris Agreement from an IPCC perspective, we need to get to 1.5 degree. And even if we get to 1.5 degree, in 50% of the cases, even if we get to net zero, in 50% of the cases, we actually miss 1.5 degree. We'll be at 1.6 or 1.7 degree. And so in essence, we need to reduce emissions by 100% to 2050. And then by 2070 or so, we need to be 125% down. So we do need to actually do some carbon dioxide removal. so that we're actually getting to 1.5 degree in the long term. So, and to get there, it is paramount, of course, that we are doing two things. First, to align with Paris, the necessary and sufficient condition is to de-brown the economy. So we actually have to keep the stranded assets in the ground. If the stranded assets are digged up and sold for whatever price, we will be missing the Paris Agreement. And second, we need to green the economy. And so the green taxonomy is there to guide us to green the economy, to keep our lifestyle, and it is linked in the tech report to the Paris Agreement because it also has a declining balance in the tech report. So let me explain in 2 slides what I mean by that. So first, the green taxonomy is a supervision mechanism that affects both a corporate disclosure, so an issuer as well as a financial market participant. This slide is kindly designed by my colleague Nadia Humphreys. And so we have a company, the company has different activities. These activities may be signaled by different plans. And based on different KPIs, such as revenue, CapEx or OpEx, here in this slide revenues, we can determine to what extent the company potentially is green. It's a lot more complex than this simple chart, but that's simply the company's taxonomy report. And then on the other side, we have a financial product that may...
Sorry, Andreas, can I interrupt you here for a clarification?
Sure.
So the taxonomy is a list of definition, you'd say, of what is a sustainable activity from a company standpoint. And this is what the taxonomy focuses on, right?
The taxonomy is a dictionary of activities, regardless if these activities are part of a company or a project or an investment or a community. So it's a dictionary of activities. The taxonomy itself is activity-based, not legal entity-based, if you want so. Of course, practically it's operationalized via companies or via investment products. But in itself, it's a dictionary. So for instance, the Sustainable Finance Disclosure Regulation is one regulation using the dictionary. There may well be many other regulations, such as the green supporting factor, using the dictionary. And then looking at the financial product side, so say a very simplistic financial product which just invests in 2 companies, A and B. Company A is entirely green, company B is 40% green, and then you have a taxonomy report for the financial product. So that in itself means that as of today, we have thresholds such as 100 grams of CO2 equivalent per kilowatt hour for electricity generation that determine the extent of greenness in 2020. But net zero 2050 means that we're at 0 in 2050. So we're not at 100 grams of CO2 equivalent per kilowatt hour, we're at 0. We have to have a declining balance also in the taxonomy. And this declining balance is the crucial aspect for Paris alignment. And that's why page 21 of the tech report is so important. On page 21, and I'll read it out to everybody just to see it, energy generation from gases or liquid fossil fuels should only be considered to make a substantial contribution to climate change mitigation where it meets the technical screening criteria, which we recommend to be set at less than 100 grams of CO2 equivalent per kilowatt hour, reducing in 5-year increments to 0 grams of CO2 per kilowatt hour by 2050. So this last piece...
Just here again, if I may.
Yeah, of course.
Before we move on to the our other 2 panelists, just another point of clarification. So at this stage, not all activities that are being undertaken in the EU are covered by the taxonomy, right? Only those with a significant impact on climate change and then the tackling climate change.
Yes, correct. So not all activities are covered by the taxonomy at this point. Anything that had a substantial contribution to climate change mitigation or climate change adaptation has been coded. But of course, from the climate change angle, the Paris alignment is key to the actual taxonomy to make it meaningful. And so these words here, and we're talking about essentially 11 words, or 10, if you take that as one, are actually the alignment with the Paris Agreement. We're going in 5-year increments down. In the benchmarks legislation, we have the actual speed. We say 7%. The taxonomy doesn't have a speed. It just says every 5 years it goes down, and by 2050 it's at 0.
Okay, great, brilliant. Now, so we have a list of activities covered. We have some criteria to get there by 2050, or let's be optimistic before that. Now, Dominique, I'm moving to you. You work at Michelin. Can you share with us whether what Michelin is doing is currently covered by this taxonomy? If not, why isn't it covered? Do you think Michelin if it isn't covered, has nothing to bring to reaching the climate goals. What's your view on that? And if you don't mind, Andreas, stopping the sharing of your screen.
David, can I come in on one point?
Yeah, sorry, go
This
ahead.
particular aspect has been forgotten in the delegated act that was drafted on Friday.
Okay.
So in the tech report, it's Paris aligned. The draft delegated act somehow forgot the Paris alignment. That's why it's important to mention this today, just for everybody's perspective. So these green words are missing in the draft delegated act. That's a very recent development. I think it's a genuine error, because why would you have a green taxonomy that wasn't Paris aligned, right? There would have been a lot of industrial lobbying here, and very much not in the interest of the citizens. But just to highlight, at the moment it appears, and a lot of scientists are still looking where that particular piece of sentence is in the draft delegated act, but the Paris alignment seems to have been missing from the draft delegated act. Now I will stop this screen.
Thanks, Andreas, for that. Dominique, to you.
Hello. Yeah, thank you, David. Thank you for your question. First, I would like to say that we at Michelin see the European taxonomy as a huge opportunity to support the data harmonization, the transparency, and the comparability of ESG data, and to support the development of sustainable activities. While also it's important ensuring an equitable treatment with international competitors, and by integrating also, this is important, specificities and constraints specific to each branch of industry. Now, to come to our activity and sector, if European taxonomy today covers the transport sector, it currently does not contain technical criteria of evaluation specific to the tire industry. That remains so far in a kind of gray zone. However, the tire, through its rolling resistance, represents in average 20% of the energy consumption and therefore of the CO2 emissions of a vehicle, which is huge. And it means that through actions to further reduce the rolling resistance of tires, the tire industry may have a very important contribution in our mind to the reduction of the emission of the transport sector in the EU. And so, depending on the level of ambition of the criteria that would be specified for the tire industry, and because all the tires do not have the same performance in terms of rolling resistance, the contribution of the tire industry could represent up to 20% of the reduction of the total transport sector in the EU, which in our opinion may be significant. And of course, the Michelin Group is ready to collaborate with the European authorities to identify the possible ways of application to its industry.
Okay, thank you. So what you're saying, if I summarize, is that there are a lot of gains to be made in terms of reducing our carbon emissions through improving the efficiency of many products, but not all of these improvements are currently being captured by the taxonomy. It looks at, if you make electric vehicles, you are in. If you improve the efficiency of any vehicle, electric or not, you're currently not covered.
You may be, even if you are not 100% electric, but once again, it will depend on the threshold you will fix for some criteria, and that will contribute to the reduction of CO2 emissions per kilometer of the automotive industry.
All right. I move to you, Eleonore. From what has been said so far, do you think this will really change the way funds are invested and influence how investors make their capital allocation decisions? How can we use the taxonomy as investors?
I think the taxonomy is a weighted, not as for what it is, not for the, because it's a taxonomy. It's a way. What's really awaited is what will come after that. Is clear guidance and clear rules about how an investment is or is not sustainable. Whether it's Paris aligned, whether it's green, whether it's sustainable, the vocabulary doesn't really is not really important, because people speak with our clients, and I think it's the case for all clients. They speak with what they hear and what they know. They don't really hear about the taxonomy, they know that Europe is doing something if they do. But what they're really waiting is to know whether the products that are being proposed to them are sustainable or are not. And the great tool that the taxonomy is and represents will help ultimately to have products that are clearer and that are that bring clarification and a better understanding of what's inside the products that the clients are actually investing in. Now, is it going to change the way funds are done? I'm sure it will, because funds that see themselves as sustainable will need to have a high proportion of the companies they invest in that are taxonomy aligned, definitely. The risk here is that some companies, and what Dominique was saying just before, with some activities not really being recognized by the taxonomy, it means that some companies might not be inside the scope while they are really instrumental in the transition that we need to go to. And so the risk we have is that today we have a lot of sustainable funds with various quality and level of sustainability. Tomorrow, if the only way to be sustainable is to be taxonomy aligned, we might have a lower number of possibilities to invest in and make the investment universe maybe poorer. So we really have to be sure, and I know that well, the group that Andreas is in is really working very hard to make sure that everything is taken into account. We need to have a universe as wide as possible of companies to be able to invest in, so that we have diversification possibilities for investors. Today, it's impossible when you're a regular investor to only invest in very sustainable companies, very thematic oriented companies, because you need to diversify your portfolio. And if you need to diversify, you need to look at all kinds of companies, the ones that really focused on the solutions, and also the ones that are in transition, and well, a whole set of different companies. So in this, the taxonomy is looking at these different stages, but it has to be wide enough while being very clear with clear guidelines, like this is going to happen, so that we don't end up with funds that are clones from each other, from all different asset management companies that are doing clones and that don't really help to make a diversified portfolio.
Thank you, Leonore. And I see we have some questions from the audience, and two very interesting questions. So what you said, Leonore, is that there's a risk that everyone applies the taxonomy very strictly. We end up with more concentrated portfolios and basically less diversification, which brings us to the question, and that's the question where Andreas, I'm sure you can shed some light. Is it the end of the road for the taxonomy? Are there more environmental objectives coming? What's the next for the taxonomy?
Yeah, so it's important to highlight the prime purpose of the taxonomy, which is the green supporting factor. So essentially, it's activities that are worth a subsidy. Not being green by taxonomy does not mean that you're brown. It just means that you're not particularly helpful in a substantial way to actually support climate change mitigation or climate change adaptation. So to directly address Eleanor's very valuable concern, for instance, retailers, which are not particularly addressing it either way, are perfectly fine to be invested in. They are just not hugely involved, or pharmaceutical companies, in climate change mitigation or climate change adaptation. So take the likes of Pfizer or AstraZeneca or Moderna. They've clearly done a huge task for humanity recently, but on climate change mitigation, climate change adaptation, they're not number one on the list because simply it's not their task. So it's very important to highlight that Paris-aligned investing is, in the first case, about de-browning. So it's much more important what's not in the portfolio than what is in the portfolio. And the second thing is that the trajectory, you're moving down on the actual greenhouse gas emissions. So you have to have a trajectory, not a static portfolio that doesn't move, but a portfolio that constantly enhances. Essentially, Paris alignment only works if we are constantly enhancing our portfolios year on year on year, and if we're de-browning the portfolio straight away. To have some green cherries, if you want, on top is very nice. is based on the activities that the companies are putting their capital expenditures in. And no portfolio will be 100% green. That's not going to work. The EU Ecolabel is not recommending that either. We're maybe looking at 20, 30, 40% gradually increasing over the years. So it's very important to say Paris alignment means de-browning and means a continuous improvement. Taxonomy today is a list of activities that may be eligible by 2025 or so for essentially a subsidy via the European Central Bank in terms of loans that these companies may be receiving from the house bank. So it's a very different purpose. It's a dictionary that can be used for lots of things, but the prime purpose for the taxonomy is not the construction of an equity portfolio, not even a fixed income portfolio. It's the situation when a small and medium-sized enterprise goes to its house bank and is requesting refinance conditions. And if that small and medium-sized enterprise then is involved in an activity that actually makes a substantial, not just a contribution, but a substantial contribution to climate change mitigation or adaptation, then we would like them to have better refinance conditions than they would otherwise get.
Thank you, Andreas. To build on that, Michelin today does quite a lot to enable people to, for example, extend the life of their tires. And this is something that today, is not considered to contribute sufficiently to mitigating climate change to be covered by the taxonomy. So at a later stage, will the taxonomy start considering other environmental contribution beyond addressing climate change, so that companies making stuff like Michelin is doing enter the scope of the taxonomy?
That's for me, right? So, David?
Yeah.
So we have four. So at the platform, we're now looking at four further environmental criteria. It's biodiversity, it's circular economy, it's pollution control, and it's essentially marine and ecosystems. So and they all will be coded into the dictionary. And then we separately in the data and usability group that's led by Helena from BNP Paribas actually, we'll be looking at the proxies and the metrics for implementing all of this. But if I may point something, since Michelin is on the call, the scope 3 information is getting much more important. And
sorry, definition here for our participants. Yeah. Scope 1, scope 2, scope 3. To put it very simply, if I may, scope 1 are the emissions from a company from its direct operations, like it has a factory burning some coal. It's scope 1. Scope 2 is the CO2 emissions from the electricity it uses, and scope 3 is everything else. So when you use a product and the use of the products made by the company and the emissions induced by that are scope 3, right?
Yes, and thank you very much for translating for a confused academic. So there's two sides to scope 3. We have the upstream and the downstream. So the upstream is your suppliers and the downstream is your customers. And climate change, the cause of climate change, not the symptom, the cause of climate change is fossil fuel scope 3 downstream. So all the customers of the fossil fuel companies, coal, oil, and gas. And now when some of the providers, and it's a direct recommendation to Michelin to talk to them about it and think about it, and Continental might want to do the same thing, some of the providers are allocating scope 3 emissions to any supplier, which means Michelin ends up with scope 3 emissions that are higher than a fossil fuel company because there's so many people using their tires. So right now in the scope 3 estimation methodologies, and that's slightly beyond the work that the EU technical expert group was supposed to do. We're only supposed to set minimum standards. We're not supposed to tell people to estimate scope 3 other than to use a precautionary principle. But right now, some of the scope 3 numbers circulating from the weaker suppliers would show a Michelin or Continental right up there with an Exxon or a Total, right? So that doesn't make that much sense. Because
let's hear Dominique on that, please.
Yes.
Dominique, are you calculating your scope 3? Do you find it fair that when someone uses your tire in a big SUV, this is being counted towards your CO2 emissions?
So effectively, we are calculating our scope 3, and I would say scope 1, scope 2, scope 3, just to give you an order of magnitude. Scope 1 plus 2 is 3 million tons CO2 per year. Scope 3 is 140 million tons per year, and 90% of that is the usage phase of our tires. Now our conception is that we cannot alone tackle this scope 3 and the usage phase. We have a direct lever through the rolling resistance I was mentioning. But at the end of the day, what is important is collectively in ecosystem to reduce through different levers and initiatives the scope 3 reduction. And it might be through the kind of energy that is used, such as hydrogen. It can be through motorization. It can be working with OEMs, with funders, with companies producing energy. I think what is important for us is to say, okay, how can we collectively reduce this the impact of this usage phase?
Thank you. I have a question from the audience here, and I will direct it first to you, Eleonore, but Dominique and Andreas, you, of course, feel free to jump in afterwards. How can we avoid the phenomena of greenwashing with the current not very clear taxonomy framework? I'm sorry, Andreas, for not very clear. That's the question. Eleonore.
Well, I think the taxonomy is a starting point. I mean, it's not the end of everything. It has to be translated into something that's understandable by everybody. If you start, there was an article I read this morning about the taxonomy and the delegated acts that were drafted. And when you read this, honestly, if you're not into it, you don't understand anything because it's way too complex and very, very, it goes into every detail of every sector. And that's normal because it has to be very, very precise. But it has to be then explained in a very simple way, not simplistic, but simple way. And when it's going to be translated into an eco label or any kind of label, a social label as well, and a more general European label, then it's going to be clearer. Greenwashing, you're never really going to completely avoid it because there are companies that are very, very good at marketing. They're just very good. And so you have to have clear rules to put in front of that. And that's why a European label is going to help because you're either in the label or out of the label. Now, once you have labels, it's not a matter of black or white because once you have the label, there's a certain granularity in the quality of the funds that are going to be labeled. So I think it's actually for the financial, the banks, private banks or retail banks that really need to work on the pedagogy around sustainability as a whole, not just taxonomy, because the taxonomy is what we're talking about today, but it's a more general work around explaining and making sure that the end investor understand what they're actually helping to finance. And I think this is really key. It's a lot of topics together, but again, remember that a client that enters into a bank doesn't have the taxonomy in his head. They just want to either have an impact or invest sustainably or stop investing in activities that don't fit with their values. It takes many different forms. And then in a few months, years, we're going to have it all crystallized into investments that are taxonomy aligned, Paris aligned, labeled, whatever. But I think the taxonomy will help with this dictionary, like you were saying, Andreas. I think it as well. I see it as a dictionary, but then we need to develop this into a common grammar as well. And the grammar tool is going to be key so that end investors understand all this.
Can you just give us a bit more clarity? You talked about labels. So we know we have people here today from several European countries where they have labels, SRI labels, green labels. So is there going to be a European label? If so, when? And how would it differ from the existing labels? Will it replace them or be yet another label that funds will be able to apply to?
I really think that a European label will help make things clearer because today it's good to have local labels, but they're obviously different from each other. And so it doesn't really help to make things clearer when you're in several countries. If you're Belgian and you're only concerned with the Belgian market, then you use the towards sustainability label and you're happy because you're either in this label or not. But then if you go to France, which is the country next to it, you just have another label that doesn't have the same rules. The one is on exclusions, the other one is more on a best-in-class approach, and so you're not really talking about the same thing. So today we lack clarity and we lack homogeneity. If we tomorrow have a European label that either replaces or works with the current labels, with a possibility of labels to work together, we'll have a much clearer and simpler view for investors. So yes, I hope we will have this European label, not just an eco label, because that addresses only the environmental factor, and really gives the assurance that you're not harming the environment. That is great, but we need the same for the social aspects, because many clients are actually asking and hoping to have a social impact as well, not just an environmental one. I know that the S is less in the Paris Agreement, but still it's very important for a sustainable investor to address this factor. And then so you have the S, you have the E, and then maybe you need a global label that encompasses everything.
Thank you. Does Dominique, Andreas, would like to add anything to this?
No, not particularly.
Okay. Well, we are flooded with questions. We have 13 questions from the audience that are begging for answer. One of them is, how about R&D and so CapEx? Is it covered by the taxonomy at all? And if so, will it ever be covered?
Yeah, if I may come in here, and as a quick comment for Dominique, I think you might want to check that you don't get more scope 3 than Total has, which would be unfair, at least in my view, because you're an enabler and you're not a cause. And some of the providers currently get that wrong. So that was just my reach out to your sector and the tire sector. You're certainly somewhat hard done by at the moment, in my personal view. Coming to CapEx, capital expenditures is actually the key metric in the taxonomy in the long term. So as I just said, taxonomy is very much about the long term. It can be used by various legislations. And when you look at the actual taxonomy report, then it does say that in fixed income, the measures to split a company into activities are capital expenditures, and if they're not relevant, operating expenditures. And in equities, the language from the report is use revenue. And if you want to have a forward-looking measure, because revenue, of course, is last year, take capital expenditures because that's the future. So capital expenditures are absolutely key. Just to put it on companies doing good marketing, if you're Brussels Airport, there's a certain Scandinavian oil company that has 99% of its marketing be very green. Everything you can see in an airport is green, but the capital expenditure may not be that green. In fact, it may be 90% brown. So in essence, capital expenditure is the key measure. And the beauty with it is that any management team that wants to be green, they can do green capital expenditure anytime. Turning your revenue green will take a while because you got legacy products or legacy services, but capital expenditures can be green from next year, from tomorrow if you wish to. It's just a matter of actual commitment. So that's a key aspect of the taxonomy in the medium term, and I'm convinced that in 2 to 3 years we'll have much better data splitting firms by capital expenditure.
Well, then, Dominique, then the question to you is, has the taxonomy influenced Michelin's CapEx and investment plans? Do you have examples of green investments in the pipeline?
Oh, I think we are, we have many investments, and I would say that targeting the reduction of our impact is a booster for innovation. And so there are many investments or many partnerships or joint venture currently to help us accelerate and contribute to this reduction. For example, just one example, we are currently heavily investing in biosourced materials. We have constructed in France the first demonstrator unit capable of producing butadiene using biosourced ethanol.
So we are losing you slightly, Dominique. Can you repeat the last sentence, please?
Yes, we built in France the first demonstrator unit capable of producing butadiene using biosourced ethanol.
Butadiene, what is that? Can you just, for me, I'm not sure to know what you're referring to.
So it's butadiene. So it's, I would say, synthetic rubber, a component of synthetic rubber. And usually it's produced through the refinery of oil. And then we have a unit to experiment its production from vegetal origin. And you know that there are different generations then that we can use to produce these biosource materials. So clearly, typically, we have this kind of investment for producing biosource materials, but also closer to the final product. We are developing new tires with low running resistance and especially designed to fit with electric vehicles. So this is the kind of investment, or in material or in development, that could be considered as green investment.
Thank you. Two more questions from the audience relating to this. Do you think industries may clean up their acts in the European nations because of this regulation, but not have the same drive to clean up their acts in other developing markets from where they operate? And the related questions was, is there any taxonomy somewhere else in the world? Who wants to take that one? Maybe start with you, Andreas, and then Leonor, you can jump in.
Yeah, so there is taxonomies in China, actually 3 of them. It's split up in separate use cases. Canada is developing a taxonomy. Many of these are closely related to the European Union taxonomy. And then also, I am very comfortable that in practice, investors will be able to assess issuers anywhere in the world, even issuers that do not operate in the European Union, because the vendors are conducting the taxonomy assessments and will have, same way they have ESG data, they have taxonomy compliance data by the first half of next year, at least the earlier vendors. There's even some early kind of prototype products out already. And so in essence, in practice, for any company of a significant liquidity and significant investability, you will have a taxonomy assessment. I'm very confident with that. And please feel free, if there's any further questions that we don't manage, I'm very happy to answer them on LinkedIn for any of the audience.
Okay, that's well taken. And Leonor, would you like to add anything to that?
No,
yes.
no, I think. Oh wait, no.
Go on,
before, and I think it's the fact that the world is as it is today. I agree with Andreas. A company today, because it's invested in by asset managers that are based in Europe, they're going to be assessed anyway, and they will have to be transparent on this, because this is gonna help enforce transparency, and everybody's going to be explaining the same things about themselves. And so what Dominique was explaining right before, I think every tire company tomorrow will have to report on the same kind of criteria, and this is going to make everything clearer. Now, to just make the link with end investors, what Michelin is doing might not come in the hands of the end investor, but it's processed by the asset manager, who then in turn decides to put it in their funds, and then the end result is a sustainable fund, because Michelin is more sustainable than another tire company. And so this is the way it works, and it's going to be used in every company, every single fund, whatever the region of the fund is.
Dominique, you wanted to add something to that?
Yes, the question here, what is occurring in the rest of the world is very important, because competition is international. So having a framework in Europe in a region like Europe is absolutely important, but it's also important that the different platforms collaborate to have the same rules in the different part of the world. Here, the support of the regulator is absolutely key to design a fair level playing field. And what I would add is that we mentioned this international collaboration and work with different platforms, but there is another challenge, and I'm sure that Andreas is aware of it, is then the transposition of the European directive into national laws of member states. And here also, it's important that consistency is until the end of this transposition. And just to take one example, to illustrate that, the obligation of external certification of the ESG reporting. So it's compulsory today in some countries, not in other one. And so we have no issue of being audited and controlled and certified by external auditors in our ESG reporting. Then we have an issue when it's not the case for competitors based in other European countries.
Thank you. We've talked for the last 40 minutes about the taxonomy. I hope this has brought some lights about what it is, what the purpose is, what the strength and weaknesses of this regulation are. Now, I would like to ask to the three of you whether people refer to the alphabet soup of ESG because it's not just about taxonomy. There are other regulations coming live as well. And so in your mind, which regulation will have the greatest impact on EU investors and companies apart from the taxonomy? And if you can explain why, starting with you, Andreas.
I think the biggest long-term impact is going to be the benchmarks regulation because that's the actual Paris alignment. So to get a Paris alignment, we need to de-brown the economy. The benchmarks are already out there in double-digit numbers. The legislation is final. The precautionary principle is in there. In fact, the benchmark legislation is the first official legislation interpreting the taxonomy, even though it's not ready. So I think in the long term, the benchmarks regulation will have the biggest impact, even bigger than the taxonomy itself.
And you were instrumental in creating these benchmarks, weren't you?
Yes, we in the tech created the benchmark. I was in the subgroup, but if you're looking at Paris alignment, and this was also the task, the benchmark regulations task was to Paris align. And if you wanted in the very simple analogy, that's the sticks. The taxonomy is the carrots, like, oh, let's try to get better refinancing condition for green things. The benchmarks legislation is sticks. We have a double-digit number of asset owners already investing in it. We see asset owners in-house developing benchmarks that are Paris aligned and that are climate transition benchmarks. So since that is the single biggest problem in the ESG alphabet soup, if you want, so I think that's going to have the biggest impact. Later on, we may have social legislation. So for instance, diversity aspects, of course, are very, very crucial. Diversity not only in the boardroom, but particularly diversity in top management. If you look at the current data situation, we know very little about women in top management. We know a lot about women in boardroom, but I would argue that women in top management is more important than women in boardroom, although women in boardroom is important, right? But top management is more important. And then there is other aspects of conflicts of interest, governance. MiFID II in itself has a very good influence on governance there. But so from the legislation we have today, the benchmarks legislation clear is the most successful. It's finished, it's applied, and it's driving investors towards net zero 2050, which is going to be the first European climate law.
About the climate benchmark, thanks for that. There is distinction between the two types of climate benchmarks. Can you just briefly shed some lights about why this distinction?
So the regulator gave us two names in the second version of it. They were initially called different. One is called Paris Aligned Benchmark. The other one is called Climate Transition Benchmark. We decided that the Paris Aligned one is the one that's somewhat more ambitious. So that's the one that is 50% decarbonized to start with, and then goes 7% down. The other one is 30% decarbonized to start with, then goes 7% down. They're quite similar, and they both ended in net zero 2050. But the Paris Aligned one is the one that is the steeper start, if you want so. So it's the more ambitious one to take off from. If you look at the number of investors, in particular in France, there's over a dozen investors that's already invested in some of the products. So that's moving, the train is moving fast, and it's very likely that a lot of the benchmark funds will eventually also be aligned with the green taxonomy. But the actual getting to Paris is really about de-browning your portfolio. And that means that you have a lot of space for diversification. All you need to do is avoid the worst guys out there. So if you're actually getting rid of the worst 2, 3, 4%, either by name or by weight, depending how you look at it, then you're getting there. And if I may just look at the real market, right? So if you look at the Tesla versus Exxon stock price development this year, it's fantastic. If you look at the fact that NextEra Energy is the most valued energy company in the US, and that's not Exxon or Chevron, that's NextEra Energy right now. I mean, the world is changing, and the de-browning is working pretty well.
Yeah, NextEra being a leader in developing renewable energy in the US, right?
Yes, and it is among all energy companies the most valued at the moment certainly last time I looked. So it's actually more valuable than Exxon at the moment in markets, which shows this beautiful feature. Market can look forward. Revenues and accounting, unfortunately, can largely only look backwards, apart from CapEx and some of the cash numbers. So I think we're on the right direction, and the benchmarks certainly, and the funds that are aligned with the benchmarks, of course, it's not only benchmarks, it's the funds as well. They are popular around the world. We're providing feedback to people in California, in Asia, elsewhere. So that's going to be the biggest impact, in my view, in the long term.
Eleonore, from your point of view, maybe you want to add something on the climate benchmark, or share with us which is your, between brackets, favorite EU regulation?
Well, between brackets, yes. No, I guess there's one other regulation that is really going to change the way investors are going to be exposed to sustainable products. And I'm not just talking about environmental products that are Paris aligned. I'm talking more broadly. It's the regulation that is coming soon, actually. But it's called MiFID II, with a part, it already exists, MiFID II, but it's with a part on asking banks to ask to their clients their ESG preferences. And once you're asking your clients their ESG preferences, the natural answer for banks is to be able to offer sustainable products that are ESG aligned with what the clients are actually expecting. Once this becomes mandatory, you will have naturally more funds that are being proposed to clients, that are being explained to clients, more clients that are being exposed to the topic and that are inclined to actually accept to go in this impact journey, if I may call it that way. And it's just a matter of the financial sector being the bridge that they need to be between the people who have the money and want to have an impact, and the company that actually have the means to do this impact because they are a tire company with great ideas, or they are this renewable energy company or any other. And so by just explaining to clients what they could be investing in, what they could stop from investing in as well, you're going to have a mechanical increase of sustainable investments. And of course, many of those are going to be directed toward Paris-aligned activities because they're going to be much better understood thanks to the taxonomy. But I also need to go back on what Andreas was saying. We're talking about the taxonomy, we're talking about these benchmarks. I think it's really key to see not only the activities of companies, but the way they're actually producing their products and services. Their practices, the ESG practices, remain very important. It's not just about the activities, it's really about the way they're doing these activities. Andreas was talking about the number of women at the top management is one of the things that we need to look at. How are they actually producing all this? We could be looking at gender diversity, we could be looking at many other aspects, but I think ESG remains very important to be sure that you're not going in companies that might be looking good on the basis of the products they're producing, but the way they're doing it is not just, it's just not right.
We've had several questions from people asking, now we've mentioned now a few regulations, taxonomy, the EU climate benchmarks, now MiFID. So people are asking, how does all this gel together? And nobody has dared to speak out SFDR so far, which is the other regulation, that the big elephant in the room at the moment. So I'm throwing it at you. Does anyone want to try explain synthetically how at least taxonomy, SFDR, MiFID can come together? Yeah, go ahead, Andreas.
I'm happy to do it. So first of all, we have sticks and we have carrots. And so benchmarks is very much the sticks. That's the sticks to make sure that there is less and less incentive for any fresh cash for fossil fuels. Then we have the carrot side. And on the carrot side, we have a multi-layered structure. So the taxonomy is the basis, the dictionary for what's green, and then later on dictionary for what's social and so forth. So it's just the basis that every other legislation can reference into. Why do we need this? Because greenwashing is a huge problem, brownwashing isn't. So we didn't need that on the stick side because no one is brownwashing themselves. So so on that basis, then you have MiFID II, which is very clever in a way that just asking the people about it makes them think about ESG. And an important side note, when you look at those people that offer professional trainings in the COVID crisis, registrations are down for every finance subject other than ESG finance. ESG finance registrations are still going up, because people are realizing that ESG is going to be integral part of finance, is going to be mainstream very, very soon. In the US, it's already a third of assets. In Europe, it might be more than non-ESG in about 5 years. So
if I can do some product placement here, Andreas, we can see this through the number of people who have done the Candriam Academy so far. Sorry, I couldn't resist.
Very happy for you to say that. I'm sure anyone else with their academies would say similar things. So it's really strong to see how in COVID ESG trainings are not at all going down, they're going up. So then you have MiFID II, then you have this the Sustainable Finance Disclosure Regulation, which in itself has a slightly different angle than the green taxonomy. Is also social, has a different purpose, so uses part of it if you want. So then you will later on get the green supporting factor, and you may see all sort of other legislations in the asset management, insurance, and the force space using the dictionaries. So and what we are really doing with the green taxonomy and the social taxonomy and also the harmful taxonomy, aka the brown taxonomy, is we're defining dictionaries. And these dictionaries are conceptual. They need to be interpreted with what data is available and what are the proxies, and they will be interpreted largely by the vendors in the market. And they will then be used by a range of other legislations, kind of like an app, essentially, linking into it. So I think that's the fairest way to explain it. On the stick side, we're already very far. The benchmarks are out there, they're running, and they're working very well. And this is the number one sufficient and necessary requirement for Paris alignment. On the carrot side, which is the number one for living well when we're Paris aligned. So Paris alignment itself is de-browning, but making sure we have the quality of life. Of course, we need green everything. There, we're currently at the stage of building the dictionary, reforming the dictionary. That's a much longer process because greenwashing is such an epidemic compared to brownwashing, which is inexistent. And so you'll just have to give us a little bit of time of going through that process, working through the draft, working through the feedback processes, and then over time we'll move forward. And to reassure you, there's a lot of connectivity with the Canadian and the Chinese green taxonomies to make sure that they're quite aligned and there is no confusing signals. Or not too many confusing signals to the global market. As you may understand, the Canadian position on tar sands is economically somewhat different from a European position on tar sands. So there's going to be certain discrepancies, but otherwise, I think we're very much moving in the right direction, and we're moving at very high speed in the right direction for the speed that European legislation normally takes. So you might think that is slow, but a lot of other European legislation is a lot slower.
Thank you, Andres. Eleanor, would you like to add anything to that before we move on to Dominique?
No, it was perfectly explained. I couldn't have done it better.
Excellent. Dominique, how about you? What's your favorite or the EU regulation you think we haven't discussed yet? You think we play a big role, especially for Michelin?
As a matter of fact, certainly the non-financial reporting directive that is coming, because it's probably essential to collect information which will feed European taxonomy tomorrow. And the taxonomy and all the regulation framework of sustainable finance cannot work without data and a transparent, reliable, and right reporting. That's the reason why.
Yeah, so it's the one people refer to as NFRD, right?
NFRD.
So NFRD, SFDR, for everyone trying to, who was not confused yet, now you are. Okay, thank you, Dominique. Now, maybe another more lighter question for you, Dominique, we just got, and that maybe will conclude at least the serious part of the conversation. Can we expect, and that's a real question we got, can we expect Michelin to integrate ESG sustainability consideration into the guides, the Michelin guides in the future?
Okay, interesting, because you know we have a deep conviction, and I could elaborate if you have time or in another session, that so everything we decide and do at Michelin must be sustainable. It must be sustainable. It is considering equally the impact of the decision and action on the generation of profit, on people inside and outside of the company, and on the planet. And so all the group's entities are working on how to deploy what does it mean concretely in their domain, on the market, with our customers and our activity. And the Maps and Guides department, so what we call now the Experience business line, is reflecting on the deployment of this sustainable vision. And so the Red Guide has initiated the attribution of green stars. You know, the red stars.
Yeah.
So has initiated this year the attribution of green stars according to some criteria. For example, recognizing that restaurants are struggling against the waste of food, which is a real problem worldwide. So if there are specific initiatives like that, so there is a list of criteria, and it just started this year.
Wow, so there is substance behind this. It's very impressive to see that even that area, Michelin is doing something really positive. I propose we wrap up here. I would like to thank you all, Eleonore, Andreas, Dominique, for sharing your views. I hope this helped the audience to get more clarity on this sometimes a bit confusing, complex topic. And I thank you all for attending, and sorry we couldn't take all the questions, but they were just too many. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, David.
Thank you very much.